From what I've heard, you've had a really interesting day talking about the use of evidence in policy making. So whenever you talk to people, they say, yeah, well, we would use evidence in policy making, but it's the politicians that get in the way of that, because politicians come in, they have views, they have values, they have opinions, they have very short time schedules, etc. So actually, there's a complete mismatch between the cycle of evidence and the cycle of political decision making. So the challenge to our very distinguished political panel here is actually, how do we manage to reconcile those desiderata, the desire to actually use evidence in policy making, with the day-to-day reality of what it's really like sitting there being asked to make political decisions? Because one of the things politicians always tell us is that that actually would like to use evidence, but it's not available. They actually have to come to a decision. So on the one hand, on the other hand stuff that certainly is typical of a lot of social science, if not natural science, actually doesn't really help them get to the point they need to be. So we're going to hear from our three politicians. Then we're going to throw it open for what I hope is going to be an extremely lively and challenging and interesting session with all of you. So I'm going to introduce the panel. First of all, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Jill Rutter. I am now at the Institute of Government. For many years, I was a civil servant in the havens of evidence-based policymaking that are the Treasury, Number 10, and the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Miles is here, so I have to say that, of course, DEFRA stands out above all others as being the place where evidence really determines policymaking. That's my line, and I'll stick to it. Down on the panel on my far right, but on your far left, is the Right Honourable Liam Byrne. Liam is now Shadow Minister for University Science and Skills. He's been in government as well as being Shadow. He's been a Minister in the Cabinet Office. He's been Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And his degree is in politics and modern history. I have to say that because that then allows me to come on to, on my immediate right, Dr. Julian Huppert. Note the doctor. Julian has a PhD in biological chemistry and has been a research fellow, junior research fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, and then a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. I assume that's where my brother went. Anyway, so he was elected to Parliament in 2010 and is very well known to those of us that follow him on Twitter. I follow him because I like all his tweets about cycling. But he was an Internet Hero of the Year award. That moved me on to the Right Honourable David Willetts. David I've known for a really, really, really long time. Because we actually were colleagues in the Treasury 1.5 billion years ago. He's been member of MP. He's been MP for Havant since 1992. He's actually quite distinguished because he was actually a minister in the major government and then took a prolonged and enforced sabbatical before he came back as a minister in this government. And as you all know, in a remarkable degree of stability, he and Vince Cable have sat atop the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, which has also not changed its name in the period, which is also, I think, almost unprecedented, for the past almost 4 years, as we enter year 5. So what we're going to do is each of our politicians has been given 5 minutes, and they are going to explain to us how they would answer the question. I'm going to give them the question. The reputation of politicians for not answering the question before them is, of course, a complete unevidence-based myth. They are all going to answer the question of actually how would they use evidence and networks of expertise to improve policy. So, in a completely random process, which just happened to produce exactly the same result as Rob Doubleday first thought of, we decided that Liam Byrne would go first. So, Liam.
Jill, thank you very much indeed, and afternoon everyone. And I guess I want to start with a word of congratulations really to you. I think David was saying this is your 3rd annual conference like this, and I genuinely think that over the years that you've been meeting, there have been some really important big steps forward in the use of evidence in the business of policy making. And so, although the great curse of policy-based evidence making is still a curse that bedevils large parts of government and of politics, I think the risks attached to it are getting slimmer and slimmer. I guess my interest in this question began not actually during my undergraduate studies, but in my postgraduate studies. And as some of you know, I did my postgraduate in America. I did my MBA at the Harvard Business School. And I guess when I arrived at Harvard, I arrived with some sort of starry-eyed notions about how this august institution of learning was really going to help me in the search for truth. And of course, on your first day at the Harvard Business School, you are immediately disabused of this notion as they tell you that this place is not about the search for truth, this place is about the search for action. And what we're going to do is teach you to make decisions, take decisions, when you do not have enough time and when you do not have enough information, because that is what is going to characterize the rest of your working life. And it was something that it took me a while to reconcile myself to, but after a year and a half of them drumming this into your head, it has an effect. And I came away understanding that this actually is the challenge that we're talking about today. How, in politics or in business or in the work that you do you make decisions with imperfect information and nowhere near enough time? Now, the reason that I started my remarks with some congratulations is that I genuinely do think we've been making some progress. So there are a number of people who have been very influential, I suspect, for all of us. People like Steve Eos at the Washington State Institution is someone who a number of us have come across over the years. And for those of you who don't know it, it's quite a long-standing part of the state legislature there. It's got a brief, a commission to basically evaluate all kinds of things before it comes anywhere near a politician. And it's a very, very good model. And I think the government has done a good job in taking that spirit. It was work that I tried to advance at the Cabinet Office in my short tenure there. But the What Works networks are, I think, a really good example of how the kind of ideas that are being developed in Washington State and elsewhere can be brought back here to Britain. The 3 points I guess I want to make about the future are really these. The priority and the potential of your kind of work when it comes to policy making are going to dramatically increase in the course of the next Parliament. As we all know here, the budgets are not going to be big in the next Parliament. The budgets are going to be going down. And therefore, when you are taking money out of the system, if you care about outcomes, if you care about social policy, if you care about social justice, you do actually need good advice on what is going to do the least damage. But you've also got to do one thing more. You're going to have to put more responsibility for delivering public services and indeed economic growth out of Whitehall, because the only way that you can see standards of public service go up at a time when budgets are going down is through innovation. And you can't order innovation from Whitehall. You don't demand innovation by diktat. You actually have to let go. Now, if you're a social democrat, you remain highly concerned about equity. You remain concerned about equality. And therefore, it becomes very important, if you are letting go, that you pay far more attention to what works. I'll give you a very simple example. This Friday, tomorrow morning, I'm bringing together the Bishop of Birmingham, a large number of children's charities, the health service in my city, and a number of others. And we're going to spend the morning talking about the scandalous level of child poverty, which is increasing exponentially in my city. Now, we know that there aren't going to be huge new resources in the next Parliament for how we tackle child poverty in our city, but we therefore want to know what works. What can health services do together with infant school teachers? What is the role of the third sector, and how do we maximise their impact? What is the role of faith groups, and how do faith groups work together with business organisations? As someone who's only been in politics for 10 years, I'm firmly of the opinion that there is nothing new in life. Everything has been tried and tested before. But in a world where local parts of the country are going to be taking more responsibility for getting things right and for doing things, the premium on good policy, understanding what works, is going to go up exponentially. And that's why I guess the conclusion for you is that evaluation and evidence does need evangelists. It's not simply good enough to write lots and lots of books on things, although that might, be an interesting thing to do. That evidence, that evaluation needs evangelists. That becomes even more important in a world of distributed and dispersed decision makers. The final point, Jill, that I think I would make is that, and this is something that we're often at risk of forgetting, is that you can have the greatest strategy in the world, but if your execution is terrible, you're not going to get very far. And that is something that we don't really hear enough about. We don't hear enough about actually how do people work together in order to achieve the most effective outcomes. And crucially, in a world where we can now monitor and measure far more than we ever have been able to do before, how do you build real-time systems that actually allow you to track how you're doing and help you kind of tack and weave as results tell you you need to change? So I think perhaps I will stop there. Evaluation needs evangelists. Don't simply think about strategy, think about execution, but go into the next Parliament very clear in the knowledge that both the priority and the potential for this kind of work is going to dramatically increase.
Okay, very good, very good. Almost time. Julian.
Well, thank you very much, Jill, and it's always a pleasure to speak after Liam. I had the slightly bizarre experience of going from being a scientist, trying to feed in evidence-based policy on thoughts about DNA and various other things, to the parliamentary side. And it's been actually a fascinating learning experience for what it's actually like. And there are genuine challenges which will always be there. Liam touched on some of these. For example, the fact that there often isn't evidence of what to do on many issues. It's actually very hard to know what to do. I actually encountered this sort of personally recently when looking at cancer treatments. We have no idea of the 15-year life expectancy from contemporary cancer treatments and the comparison between them. The obvious reason is because they're contemporary. We haven't waited 15 years to find out, but you always have to make a decision without waiting. You're forced into that, and it can be quite unpleasant. So that is a huge challenge. There's also the challenge that questions aren't posed in a way where there can be huge amounts of evidence, whether because we haven't set what we're trying to achieve with a policy on the political side, or because it's just very hard to do proper tests of things. There are lots of things where you simply can't do an experiment. You can push the boundaries back. There was a study in one African country where the governing party agreed to run random political campaigns for election in different provinces, in half of which randomly allocated they campaigned for the good of the country and for half for the good of the majority tribe. It says a lot about the area that they were prepared to do this experiment with their campaigns. I don't think any party would be prepared to run a random campaign to see what happened. So you can get data, but it is very, very hard, and we're really short of those. But then there are problems that really come from the political system we have. And the thing that was the biggest shock to me was the huge political cost of a U-turn. And this is a massive thing. And for me, it's one of the biggest problems that we have within the political process, is that if a politician says they're going to do something and decides not to, that is front page U-turn, and various papers will publish the number of government U-turns so far. Now, in my scientific world, I call that a hypothesis. And there was no shame in rejecting a hypothesis. Any academic who claims they've never rejected a hypothesis is lying or not creative. But we have that running through everything else. We have, Margaret Thatcher's "The Lady's Not for Turning," Tony Blair, "I have no reverse gear." You wouldn't buy a car that couldn't do a U-turn and had no reverse gear. But somehow what we expect is for people to be absolutely determined about what they're going to do. Tony Blair, seeing 1 million people marching against Iraq, saying, "I'm going to keep going," is seen as strong leadership rather than a failure to look more broadly. That's a huge problem. And I wish we could change that and see it as a strength when somebody changes their mind in response to evidence, in response to consultation, in response to debate. We have a lot of other issues about the language that we use. I'm on the Home Affairs Select Committee, and every week we have the great and the good from all sorts of backgrounds coming to give us evidence. And what evidence means in this sense is somebody saying what they think in answer to some questions. Now, that's evidence of what they think. It's not the same as a proper paper or a proper analysis. But we use that as evidence. We spend a huge amount of time collecting words about things and not really looking at the stuff that falls behind that. And that is a huge problem. Then there's the issue which Liam touched on, which is this idea of policy-based evidence. People work out what answer they would like to have, and then they look around for evidence, either by just sifting through everything that has ever been said to find one person who will say the thing that you're looking for, or simply by commissioning the thing that you want it to be and then using that repeatedly. And that's still a huge problem. You'll have seen examples. One of them that I've been fairly involved with is the debate about drugs policy, where it is incredibly hard to get evidence seriously used in that. And we had an example of this just last week with the debate over the substance khat, which is a leaf that's chewed by the Somali, Yemeni, Ethiopian populations. And there was a proposal to ban it, to make it illegal. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs had been consulted, and they had said there is no significant evidence of physical harm, there's no evidence of social harm, it would be unnecessary and disproportionate to ban it. The government's line was, and the minister said in the debate, we accept that there is no evidence of harm, but we have to eliminate that harm, so we must ban it, which was slightly bizarre. And I have to say the Labour position was, why haven't you banned it faster? But what was striking through that was there was almost no use of evidence. We have a Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, which produced an excellent report on this drug, HAT, with lots of evidence, analysis, reports from all sorts of people. Nobody cited it in the entire debate other than me. It just wasn't seen as part of it. People would use as evidence from a collection from the Home Office who interviewed 200 women, here's what one of them said. That was seen as equivalent evidence to an entire study. What I don't want to see is policy that's just driven purely by evidence, some sort of technocracy. That is incredibly dangerous. There are things which evidence cannot tell you. It can't tell you what the aims of an education system are. That's not an evidence-based question. Once you've worked out what your aims are, you can then solve potentially for the best way of doing it. So I tend to always talk about evidence-informed policy rather than evidence-based policy, because there is political difference between all of us. We could all look at evidence, and because we're trying to achieve different things, the three of us, we'll reach different conclusions. Solutions, just a few of them. And there's a longer version. Some of you will know I wrote a policy paper on science policy, which has an entire section on this. If you haven't yet seen it, you can find it online or contact me, which goes through a lot of ideas about how you strengthen chief scientific advisors, how you introduce a chief social scientist as well, because social science is actually incredibly valuable. I see at least one person likes that. There are other things that we need to do. We have a massive dearth in understanding of technology and sort of web type things, digital type things among MPs from all three parties. There are people who get it, the vast majority don't, and the same is true for science. We have as many STEM qualified MPs as we have PPE graduates from Oxford in Parliament. If you think about the number graduating in each of those, is somewhat alarming. One thing I would say is we should try to keep STEM-educated MPs in Parliament, particularly if you live in Cambridge. But it would be nice to try to boost them to get more civil servants with that background and to have those people not just seen as specialist scientists, but able to work more broadly. We should allow more experiments, whether they're randomised control trials or whether just as a result of localisation. Let councils or police forces try different things and see what actually works a bit better. Some of them will be better than others, and we have to be not afraid of the fact that some of them will be worse than others as a result of that. I've got a minute left, or how long?
I was actually going to say, let's pick up some of these ideas for actually institutionalisation. One last comment, Julian.
One last comment is the other thing is links are incredibly valuable, because having people that you can talk to is really useful. Whether it's schemes like the CSaP fellowships, and I've enjoyed meeting people, or the Royal Society pairing scheme, knowing that I have people who I can ring up and say, I don't really understand this, please tell me, is incredibly useful.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to lots of those themes in the discussions section. David, how does it feel like actually in government doing this?
Well, I thought
decisions?
Well, I thought Liam was quite right in his point of the circumstances in which decisions are taken. I always think of it as we are GPs, not hospital consultants. We're taking decisions with limited time and limited information. You can't always ask for another round of tests and more x-rays and then come back to it. You are inevitably constrained like that. And I think that helps also to answer, once you approach it in that spirit, it helps to answer Julian's question about U-turns. It's one of them, what people are voting for, they're partly voting for predictability. They're partly voting for some kind of understanding of the set of values and the character that you will apply to all the random events that happen during the life of a government. And that's partly what democracy is. They're not simply voting for people who will do a set of randomised control trials and in light of that evidence decide what to do, because that is, amongst other things, unpredictable for a voter. So sticking to some kind of framework within which they will understand you will take decisions is quite an important part of accountability. And if you want to put it into the language of science and the philosophy of science, so we're working within a research program. A political party is a research program. It's a paradigm. We're expected to work within that paradigm. That's part of how they know what they're voting for. Otherwise, our decisions would be completely unpredictable. And I think this is, in terms of how science and evidence can feed in, this leads into the other dilemmas, I think it's been mentioned already, which is the is-ought problem. And a lot of evidence is. It doesn't always clearly follow what the ought is. And my frustration sometimes, to be honest, with academic papers is that the last 2 paragraphs are the policy recommendations. And after incredibly learned explanations of the statistical methods that have been used to analyse the data, the 2 paragraphs on the potential policy conclusions are completely throwaway observations where all the rigour has gone into the data analysis. And one of the reasons why we all love organisations like the IFS, it's one of the few organisations that tries to apply the same rigour for policy proposals as other people apply to data analysis. And how part of how you move from is to ought is a framework of values which will be the basis for your judgments, which is part of what the electors have voted for when they've chosen between the different parties. I was trying to think of all the different ways in which evidence is brought to the table in Cabinet and Cabinet Committee. I was thinking of Andrew Dilnott and his work on long-term care, what Howard Davis is now doing on Heathrow. I was thinking of Ash Dieback, an interesting, one of the most exciting forms of evidence is evidence collected by our citizens. I think the link between evidence-based policy and citizen science is important. Climate change, of course, where I think we've been too dependent on the IPCC, and I'm really pleased that we've got recently, for example, the Royal Society at last engaging explicitly in the debate with their publication. Badger Cull, we could have an entire session on the Badger Cull.
But we're not.
No, we're not, she said with desperation. And I think also some of the work on well-being, some of what Richard Layard has done, scale of, and particularly issues like loneliness and well-being amongst older people, and the extent to which various therapies can help people suffering depression or mental ill health. So I think there's fracking. There's quite a lot of that time. So all the time you are at discussions where the evidence is being fed in. What could we do better? What works and what doesn't work? We are setting up these what works centres. And the irony is that one of the differences between politics and science is in science, you're at meetings where people say, the trouble is there's all this bias to producing the positive results. We need a journal of negative results. I'll tell you, in politics, the morning papers feel like the journal of negative results. We have no problem with getting the negative results. You occasionally just wish there was a tiny little bit of positive results being reported. But how, being more rigorous in the evaluation of what works and what doesn't, and trying to act on it. In my own area of university policy, the National Scholarship Programme, the evaluation showed wasn't really having much effect on access. So we put the money to a different, and I hope better use. And there are limits to what you can do with randomised control trials to try to get this type of evidence. I remember the earnest advocates of randomised control trials in the Cabinet Office coming to me when we were bringing in our new university regime, and we were going to send recent graduates to every school and college to explain how the new system would work and to ensure people weren't put off. And someone suggested, seriously, there should be 250 schools and colleges that don't get this visit so that we can work out whether these visits are a good policy initiative or not. And I have to say, I think for any politician saying, hang on, so we're going to decide there's 250 schools that aren't going to have this opportunity. Imagine that this does actually work. And then I have to explain to Liam in the House of Commons why the 250 schools where young people's access to university has been inferior as a result of a deliberate decision that they shouldn't have the programme. Terribly sorry, we can't do a randomised control trial on that one. So there are constraints on what you can or cannot do. And then I would say finally, I was pleased, I think, that Julian mentioned social science. We have to be a bit clear in this discussion, in the time we've got. Sometimes we're using science and evidence interchangeably. Let's just be clear what we mean by evidence. Evidence includes evidence of people's moral beliefs and the attitudes of the electorate. I hope in the science we certainly have to include social science. We have to include the kind of values that we pick up from the excellent science-wise dialogues, and we do quite a few of those, which are sometimes quite chastening messages for scientists. Messages like, just because they can do it, that isn't of itself a reason for doing it. So, yes, evidence, but evidence in a broad sense, and that comes in many shapes and forms. Thanks very much.
That's brilliant. I think those were actually 3 incredibly thoughtful contributions which actually illuminate the real ways in which decision makers have to do it. I just want to come back, David, very quickly. I've heard you use this analogy before that, you know, we're just GPs and whatever. Well, sort of okay, but actually, are you not actually, as politicians, patients? And should you not be able to access hospital consultants to give you some decent advice? I mean, after all, you've got a highly paid chief scientific advisor who hopefully has a network of other people. You've got civil servants who hopefully vaguely know what they're doing, sitting there in biz working for you. So is it right that actually you're no better off than a GP with 5 minutes to see the next person presenting and move down your list?
Well, it is interesting. And you said earlier how Vincent and I have been in biz now for 4 years. And that does have an advantage, because one of the other types of decisions you can take is what evidence you would like to commission. And it's rather uncomfortable now. Some of the evidence I commissioned years ago is beginning to come in.
That's why you don't want it with policy proposals at the end.
Things like the foresight exercises run by the chief scientists are incredibly helpful. And we are beginning to, and they take 2 or 3 years, but some of the foresight exercises, like, say, the one on manufacturing, was we commissioned early on in the life of this government, and the foresight exercise on advanced manufacturing has now reported, and it is informing the policy on manufacturing as a result. So we do try, you're absolutely right, if you hang around for long enough, you can see research that you commissioned come back. I'm very interested in cognitive gain in higher education, and I'm desperately trying to get some research done on that. I think we'll be lucky if the evidence is in before the next election. So obviously, it's important that we stay around for long enough to get that evidence in.
Julian, I'm just quite interested before we go out. It struck us when the National Audit Office produced its report, very unfortunately published on the 20th of December, to get a maximum audience. I'm sure they tested that was the best time to release it, on the lack of evidence and evaluation. They didn't actually have any recommendations for the role of Parliament in actually holding ministers to at least some sort of reasonable evidence standard. I wondered if your experience in Parliament suggested that there might actually be a better role for Parliament as actually, you know, holding ministers to account for the way in which they'd made decisions.
I mean, I think that's actually the key thing, that it is possible to think that somebody made the wrong decision, but that they made it in a reasonable way. And we need to sort of separate those two things out. We tend to focus just on the decision rather than on whether somebody did it for perfectly reasonable reasons that you just disagree with. And I think Parliament needs to be better at discriminating between those two, and we're not at all. We don't make use of the resources there are. There are posts, there's the House of Commons library, but it's not all that well used. There are lots of lobby groups who are much more effective at getting messages in. But can I actually just pick up one of the things that David said, which I thought was really interesting about randomised control trials? And clearly you can't do RCTs on some things. Nobody's ever done an RCT on whether parachutes work. But if you're going to have natural experiments or RCTs anywhere, that necessarily means that some places will not get something as good as somewhere else. And if we say, as a sort of policy requirement, that we are not prepared to have some places getting things that other places aren't, then you can never test something out unless you test it out everywhere. And that is really problematic. That I like the idea that Cambridgeshire Constabulary are trying a particular new piece of technology to get police more efficiently, and that we'll try it there. It'll either be better or worse, and that's fine. If it's better, we then try and roll it out. So we do have to be prepared to allow that to happen. When there used to be, there was a DTI, as it was, used to have smart awards for trying to get very, very risky projects started. And I set up a biotech company. It won one of those, didn't work in the slightest. We had to close it all off. But there was criticism of the fact that a lot of these pots of money, and it was £45,000 for really risky things, a lot of them didn't work. And we have to accept that. The whole point of trying things that are new is that some of them won't work. And we have to be entirely relaxed about that.
So Liam, just pick up, your last role in government, I think, was as Chief Secretary at the Treasury. One of the things that people have slightly thought is on this evidence debate, the Treasury's been a bit missing in action, as, you know, not actually being maybe one of the evangelists for better evidence that it could have been. I just wondered if, you know, if you're a government in 13 and a half months' time, you know, how you would think a Treasury might actually be a better champion.
Yeah, so I had a very interesting one, because I was not only Chief Secretary of the Treasury, but I was also the Minister for Public Service Reform. So I combined a foot both in the Treasury and a foot in the Cabinet Office. And I hope this point comes out from this debate. The Treasury is actually one of the worst places for using policy-based evidence-based policy making. And what really surprised me is how little investment the Treasury makes in really understanding the economics and the value for money of different approaches. And that should change. And so, there's I think a good debate to be had about the role of the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Treasury, who I don't think is genuinely independent. I think they're also a servant, Treasury civil servant as well. And if you want a home for a chief scientist for social science, which I believe we do need, the logical home is actually the Treasury. And the second piece of work, I suppose, that is needed to kind of complement that is there's got to be a shared evidence base between departments and the Treasury. The Treasury and departments generally work off very different evidence bases, and that just sort of reflects a kind of a lack of systematic investment in evidence at the centre of government.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So hopefully that's given you lots of food for thought. So I'm going to throw it open to questions. I haven't got my glasses on. I assume there's a roving mic. Is there a roving mic? No? Yes, there is. Excellent. And I'm going to start off, and even if we know who you are, tell us who you are. And we'll take them in clutches of 3 or so. So if anyone else wants to do it. So.
I'm Brian Collins, Professor of Engineering Policy at UCL, ex-Chief Scientific Advisor for David in BIS.
We're trying to keep things in the
family. The free sauna is going already.
Yeah, it's a tough one, I hope.
But the question isn't about BIS, David. The question is about localism. At the moment, there is a distinct push of money and responsibility and authority to be pushed out to cities, local government, LEPs, other agencies which have come and gone over the years. And my question is, where is the evidence and the network and the policy, and a complement to that, the capability and capacity for that family of entities to work at those scales? Because without it, you're delegating money into a place where it may not actually deliver what you in Whitehall might want to happen, or even what they might want to happen, because they don't appreciate what they don't have any longer. They might have had 50 years ago, but they don't now. That local capability and capacity to deliver local optimism within a national framework. So my question is this about local policy and evidence as well as about national policy and evidence, and where is the thinking around that subject? Thank you.
Okay, well, does anyone else want to come in on this round? Okay, well, while you're all very quiet, I know everybody will want to ask questions at 5:10, but then whatever. Yes, there's. Thanks. Yeah.
Lindsey Brooks from the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. I'm in charge of a research programme, thinking about that. Having a 5-year budget rather than a 1-year budget to spend would enable us to better use our universities and support our academic achievements. Are there any ways to sort of think about the budgeting cycle and how that could become possible even in a time of economic austerity?
Okay, let's take those two. Sounds like I was wondering whether to give that to David first. It's quite interesting what Brian's going on about, because there's both the question of, do they have the capacity to do really evidence-based decisions? Mm-hmm. There's also a really intriguing thing that we found. We were writing a pamphlet recently at IFG on decentralisation. Actually, everybody believes in decentralisation, but actually the evidence base for decentralisation, my colleagues kept on asserting this is a good thing. Say, where's your footnote saying where anyone says that? So you might want to just come in on that, then I'll bring in the other two, then we'll go to this sort of longer-term funding point. David?
Yeah, I think that in terms of what's the evidence for decentralisation, that's, I think one of the most interesting pieces of evidence, if I remember correctly, is the study of levels of well-being in Switzerland, which shows that the cantons which have more frequent referendums are the cantons in which levels of satisfaction are higher. So people do feel more engaged.
It's restricted to a LEP, though, isn't it?
Well, you are. I think it's quite. It does tie in with. It was quite a very. It was a very influential paper which showed this in turn relates to the sense of controlling your environment, your ability to shape the world you're in. So I think there is some evidence for that. In terms of what we do, the city deal process isn't just about new freedoms for cities. It's then holding them to account for what they do with the extra money, And in fact, I now co-chair a Smart Cities Forum, which is absolutely about trying to learn from the places where we are rolling out the Smart City initiatives most rapidly. There's a lot happening in Glasgow, for example, a lot happening in Bristol, and trying to learn from what they're doing, including their mistakes, and spread that to other cities. But so I agree with the point that when you've got these increasingly vibrant civic initiatives, we do need to find from them what works and what doesn't.
And we do have a work centre, don't we, and local economic
Absolutely.
growth that you're jointly funding with communities. So hopefully Henry Overman and his friends are building a bit of an evidence base, which they admit is a bit of a blank thing. Just quite interesting, is this decentralisation and devolution, is this a sort of values-based policy that we're doing it because it's actually politically desirable, or is it an actually evidence-based policy which would then suggest if it didn't work, you'd be prepared to take the budgets back in to the centre? I mean, if the evidence proves that this is an ineffective way of boosting economic growth. I don't know, Julian.
Well, I don't
How
think
would you test this?
Well, I don't think localism is just about economic growth. I mean, I actually think it is quite an important principle about what level you should govern on. The idea that you should do things at the appropriate level. So for me, whether it works for economic growth is a question about how much you would allocate. But to me, there is a policy benefit from things being closer to the people who are deciding. So for me, it's partly a value. It's not just an evidence base. It's one of the things I'm trying to achieve is that local connection. We've done this in Cambridge with area committees and all sorts of things. But you do need to improve the capability at local government. You can't just simply pass stuff over. And there's a question about the long term. If local government is going to have the powers to do things for the next couple of years, they won't be able to build up the capability. If they know there will be a long-term thing where cities will have power, then they'll build it up. They should also collect a lot more information locally, network, there'll be central sources of information. You know, in the cycling world, where I do a lot of stuff, there was Cycling England, which was a very small central body, which provided expertise and knowledge that local people could easily pull up. So I think that there is a lot that you can do there. It's also just worth remembering quite how centralised we are. I mean, until this government, to put up a sign which said no entry except cyclists, required the Secretary of State for Transport to sign it off. You know, that is bad, and I don't need very much evidence to show that that is not an effective way of doing things at that level. In terms of the budgeting things, I mean, is everybody here from Biz? I mean, there's one or two I recognise who aren't, but I mean,
we don't play any risks with this.
I think longer-term budgeting would make a lot of sense, and I think there is an issue in the political cycle that we are often a bit too short-term. And we're not going to talk about science funding. One of the things we suggested here was to have a 15-year sustained increase we could try to get agreement around so that people can plan. We do that for some infrastructure, but not for enough. We should do more research. We should also be much more open, perhaps, about publishing research that is commissioned by governments, which involves a certain level of relaxation that when it's published, it won't be immediately used to hit the head of whichever minister commissioned it. We need to be more open about what research will show.
Isn't there a presumption that all government-funded research is published,
Absolutely,
David?
yeah, there is.
A presumption, yes.
A presumption?
Well, no, I mean, it's more than a presumption. It is the policy, and it does happen, and it's called open access, and we're delivering it. It's it's something I'm very proud of. Absolutely, it's the case.
Liam, do you want to come in on this idea of sort of longer-term funding? I mean, there's a particular problem now, isn't there? Because we're at the end of Parliament.
I'll talk about both, because when I was Chief Secretary, I introduced a programme called Total Place that was actually about devolving quite radically control over public service delivery in return for savings. And when we went out as part of that exercise that now has helped inform a lot of the city deal work that's being taken forward, some of the conclusions were absolutely remarkable. So, we had public service partnerships that were telling us they were able to deliver the public service outcomes that we hoped for up to 20% less if they had control over the way that money was integrated. And the challenge that we've got in this country, as Julian says, is we are hopelessly centralised in this country. And what that means is that the integration of policy, which you would have thought would be easier in a centralised system, is actually harder. Whitehall is terrible at integrating policy. It is much easier to integrate budgets, systems at a local level than it is at the Whitehall level. And I've thought long and hard about why that is the case. And the truth is that at Whitehall, there is just always going to be such a multiplicity of interests that need trading off, one against the other, that one, decision taking takes longer, and two, outcomes are just harder to harmonise. actually there isn't the same kind of complexity of trade-offs at a local level. And so, frankly, I mean, I found as the regional minister in the West Midlands, where you had difficult problems, one of the reasons that it was easier to solve at a local level is because you could get all the decision makers around a dinner table. And so I'm a kind of great advocate of localism because I've seen it work. However, my sort of first point really in my remarks is that I suspect that whoever takes power in the next parliament will be quite radical devolvers. But the complement to that has got to be a stronger public infrastructure around evidence and what works. And while we're building that, let's not just make it national, let's make it international. I mean, if you look at some of the, I know David is a frequent visitor to the OECD in Paris. I was there last week. Some of the work that, for example, organisations like the OECD do, we pay a lot of money towards it, is absolutely fantastic. You have got great centres for this kind of work in the United States. We should actually be thinking about how you create a global network of these sort of what works institutions that David has helped set up to help inform some of the work that is now going on at the local level. And I mean, I just want to conclude then by underlining what Julian said about long-termism. We are big believers in putting things like science spending on a longer-term framework because we think that maximises predictability, it minimises risk, and it just means people are able to package together with greater certainty more interesting things.
Okay, brilliant. Any more questions emerging? Yes, we'll go to you and then we'll come to David. Yes. Oh, two microphones go to all. Yes.
Aga Iwasiewicz-Warnik, University of Cambridge. I'm interested to hear your opinion about how do you currently think the evidence is entering policy making when it comes to policy that is based on where we are at the moment as opposed to where we want to be. And if you could give some examples, and one particular example I'm interested in, since we have David here, is how did it enter into the process of creating 8th grade technologies?
8th grade technology.
Technologies, yes.
8th grade technologies. Okay, hopefully David can answer that. David.
Yeah, David Cleverley, founding director of Centre for Science and Policy. I'm intrigued about this issue of randomised controlled trials. And if we look through the day so far at this conference, we start off in the wonderful world where rationality is all-pervasive, where we talked about the notion that what we're going to do is have these trials, whether randomised controlled trials or other forms of evidence-based gathering, to be able to arrive at the correct policies. To the extent that there was some question as to whether politicians would have any role any further in government because everything would be done by the equivalent of the Google search algorithm, just making sure that everything was done in the best possible way, in the best of all possible worlds.
So, David, for those of us who weren't here earlier, was that the Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office, or was that someone else who was making that call?
Well, I will say that Gus O'Donnell came and gave a distinguished lecture in Cambridge as part of our series, in which he effectively said that. Okay, and so Gus can come back to me and
that's because he's no longer Cabinet Secretary.
Anyway. Precisely why I use the example. But he did. He now with New Economics, he was very forceful about how he put that particular algorithmic view of the world forward. And yet, David, you say, and I fully understand where you're coming from. The notion that the papers the following day talk about postcode lotteries is a real disincentive for us to do things. And yet we know that there are areas where this works. There are areas, for example, in medicine, where you have ethics committees, and there are patients who will suffer because they didn't get the treatment because you were doing a randomised control trial. So we have solved it in some areas of our life. Do you think it is impossible to solve in politics?
Okay, that's really, really interesting. So let's just take the point from the lady from Cambridge on 8th grade technologies, which everybody else knows more about than me. So, David.
Yeah, this is what happened was there had been various foresight-type exercises. There had been one run by the Government Office of the Chief Scientist, which had called the Technology and Innovation Futures, which had been drawing on the expertise of the science community to identify, and it came up with a list of about 60 significant areas of scientific and technological advance where things were happening in Britain, which were thought to be globally significant. And the Technology Strategy Board had done an incredibly detailed assessment of technologies it was aware of, and had begun with sort of hundreds and had got 68 that were world class and 7 that were where there was a particular opportunity. And we had these several different exercises, and they were all very hard for an outsider to follow. And because they were hard to follow, they weren't leveraging any policy consequences. So all I did, and I claim no expertise myself, is I simply distilled these reports that were coming into me in something that tried to make sense of what I thought were the underlying themes. And that in turn enables policy to follow on. And indeed, this afternoon, I've come from a meeting of the E-Infrastructure Leadership Council where we're going through, one of the 8 great technologies was big data and high-performance computing. We had substantial funding from the Treasury. We're cross-checking, keep an eye on how is it doing, what is it being spent on, what results we're beginning to see. So I think it was an example of how it had become too technocratic and expert and had lost a sense of, so what are the big things happening in the science and technological community in Britain, and which one should we be backing? I think on the other question on postcode lotteries and everything and evidence, there are limits to. I think one of the interesting questions is where people accept divergence and where they don't. I have, and I think that we have less of it now. I used to have very uncomfortable conversations with my constituents coming to see me saying, why is it that this drug for MS is available in West Sussex but not available in Hampshire? That is a very hard question to answer. And there are things where we are a single nation state, we're a single tax base, we're all fellow citizens. And I would say, and oddly enough, you mentioned ethics committee, I know you're making a slightly different point. One of the things that completely frustrates the life sciences companies is if they want to test a drug and get different ethical committees in different parts of the country trying to set different conditions for the trials of the drugs. And one thing we're doing to try to help the life science industry is, look, surely we can have across the nation a single ethical standard for the trial of this drug. So there are areas where it's legitimate to say we want to go nationwide, and other areas where it's legitimate to go local. And for that, there's quite a lot of complicated political science and political culture behind it. And very final point, if there were an agreed body of evidence on everything, that would be the point at which politics then began. Politics is precisely what values then apply. Now, we do, as politicians, often argue about the evidence. That's sometimes a device to avoid being quite so explicit about what the difference are on values. But there would be, you wouldn't just feed in an answer in a computer and get a policy out. You would find there were different trade-offs, because there are trade-offs in life. We like to pretend sometimes there aren't, but there are, between equity and efficiency and growth and fairness and the environment. And those different people legitimately make different trade-offs. So the politics would be stark and clear, but absolutely essential, even if every bit of evidence was agreed.
Liam, I'm not sure whether you want to come in on this 8 technologies point, but I'm quite interested in where you see the sort of borderline at the moment between the acceptability of RCTs or sort of those sort of more rigorous ways of testing a proposition, and whether you see any sort of institutional changes that might enable that borderline to move slightly. So there was, as there are medicines, a bit more acceptance of that sort of rigorous testing as a legitimate way of doing things.
Yeah, well, you have to answer this question. If you are a localiser, you do have to answer this question. And where we arrived in the last sort of year and a half of the last government was actually based on a good old-fashioned bit of evidence gathering. We surveyed brilliant public services around the world. I produced a document called World Class Public Services, and one of the great conclusions that we drew out of that is that countries going through quite significant fiscal consolidations tended to radically localise their public services. And certainly in the Scandinavian countries, governments had protected equity and protected equality by introducing new frameworks of rights and redress, so that although policymakers and civil servants might differ in the way that they delivered things in different parts of a country, actually what they were focused on is how they made live and real an equal set of rights across the country. And so we amended the NHS constitution to introduce a number of rights there. We were beginning to investigate doing the same thing in the education system. We were looking at some of the ways of doing that in the police services. And what you have to do is you basically got to do three things. You've got to get the definition of a right sharp and clear. It's got to be sort of politically resonant. Second, you've got to have a lot of transparency so that people know actually what is going on, are rights being fulfilled, are they not being fulfilled. And third, you do need strong methods of redress. And so access to justice, whether that's administrative or formal, becomes incredibly important. And this is basically the institutional change that I think we've got to put at the heart of our public service reform if we are to, as I say, continue to innovate on the one hand and preserve social justice on the other.
Julian, how might we go around institutionalising a greater willingness to do some of this sort of testing, admitting that's still a role for values, but...
Yeah, I mean, institutionalising it is quite tricky, and some of it is about the acceptability of not getting things right. And I really dislike this phrase postcode lottery, because there's a difference between it being a decision to have something and sheer incompetence that you're not delivering things properly. And we somehow conflate the two of those. I don't think there will be an algorithmic approach until you can define what exactly you are trying to achieve. Is the purpose of education, is the aim of our education system to maximise the number of people who are reading at age 7, to maximise the number of people with 5 or more GCSEs at A star to C grade, or to produce people who are the most satisfied with their life at 50? Those are three different aims of an education system. And if you agree exactly what you're trying to do, then you could potentially algorithmically work out how to achieve it. But until you can agree what you're trying to do, there's just no way of doing it. Another example, I do a lot of stuff about civil liberties and with all the Snowden stuff. There is, some sort of trade-off between liberty and security. We all want some of both. There's a sort of an undefined ratio between them. You can't calculate the correct policy to maximise both of them when you have a sort of a term that is needed to relate the two. And I think what you were saying about the way of the conference has been is that, there's an old saying that in theory and practice are exactly the same thing, but in practice they're completely different. And I think that sounds like it's what the earlier course was like, that the theory of this, you might write some equation and solve it. It just can't work like that.
I'm quite intrigued, David. You get this example of BIS, trying to get ways of, getting more people applying to university. I mean, isn't there a sort of slightly different way of setting up? Look at some of the things that the Behavioural Insights team have done, just testing different things. So rather than say there's no offer to some students, to say actually we don't know what's going to work best, but we think there are 2 or 3 different sorts of things we could do, and actually we'd like to, rather than say somebody gets nothing, we actually are going to offer this in these places, this in these places, and this in these places, and against the assumption that something will help to see what is more effective. And I mean, isn't there a scope for doing that sort of thing, or for staging things? We roll things out, don't we, anyway, in stages. We've just been doing a study on Sure Start Children's Centres. They were rolled out in stage. Admittedly, that's the thing, a bit like cancer treatment, where you want to look at the sort of 15-year lifetime outcomes, but where we stage things to actually be more systematic about knowledge capture as we stage things and whatever. And we don't always do everything all at once. So do we really exploit the capability for learning from the way in which we implement policy?
Well, we've got, quite a few areas. As a result of devolution, we do now have a natural experiment which you can compare what's happening in England, Wales and Scotland, and higher education is one of the many places where you can do that. And we have got, but you're right, my example was of a nationwide information system explaining to young people how the system worked by sending out recent graduates. And I think that is, I put that along with the same drug being available, or indeed, as an area where there was a case for just having a England-wide programme for an English change. Universities have got a large amount of discretion about how they spend their access budgets. And one thing we're beginning to do now is saying, well, hang on, guys, we're beginning to see the evidence that's coming in, and you might begin to start seeing some convergence around the ways of spending the access money that seem more effective. And that's one of the jobs of offer, to try to start building up an evidence base, because there's so many different things happening on an individual university basis.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, right at the back, she said, proving that I really can see that far. Yes.
Hi, my name's Caroline Dines. I work here at the Royal Society in the Policy Department. You talked a lot about giving greater amounts of governance to local areas, and yet at the same time there's a certain amount of power in the EU and international organisations. Do you think there is sufficient scientific and evidence-based advice at local levels and in the EU and international organisations, or do you think that there should be something like the CSA network in both of those levels?
Okay, another question coming forward. Yes, there. Just bounce down the aisle. Yes. Stop midway. Yes. And then we'll come over to Miles. Yeah.
So we've heard lots about localism.
Can you tell us who you are?
Oh, sorry, I'm Mark Durkee. I'm a civil servant at the Home Office.
Oh, right. Not from Bits yet. Anyway.
Not from Bits, no, there are some others of us too. We've heard lots about localism as a change in the way in which we deliver public services. The other change we've seen lots of over the last decade or so is a move towards private sector providers getting more and more involved in the delivery of services. Does the panel have any views on how we can best make sure that evidence carries on being involved in the delivery of services when they're outsourced, particularly in areas like probation services and healthcare, where it's often quite hard to know what the right thing to do is?
That's a very interesting question. And then just the front, yes.
Thanks, Jill. Miles Parker from Centre for Science and Policy at Cambridge and a surviving colleague of Jill's. I wonder, could the panel discuss the interaction between evidence-based policy making and open policy making? Both are widely accepted these days as being the right way to go, but there seem to be some complexities in that interaction. I'd be interested to hear your views.
Okay. So I think they're quite different, and I think those are all very interesting. So I'm going to get the views of panels on all three. We've talked a bit about local, but I'm really interested in what you all think of the standard of evidence-based policy making within the EU. I know there's Anne Glover sitting there, sort of somewhere near Mr. Barroso as the sort of chief scientific advisor. But I mean, if policymaking in the UK is sort of closed-ish, policymaking in the EU is sort of off the scale in terms of opacity and stuff like that. Julian, no, this isn't quite a sort of Clegg-Farage debate, but I mean, a lot of our policy, particularly if we're working in partners like DEFRA and things like that, comes out of the EU. So do we think the EU does enough to promote evidence-based policy making? How would you improve that?
No, I mean, I think we desperately need to be part of the European Union. We get all benefits because there are so many problems. Just as we need to do some things on a very local scale, it's a bit pointless to fight climate change only on a local or national scale. It doesn't make much sense to ignore the rest of the world. So we need that at the international level, at the UN as well. I don't think there's enough. I think the way the EU operates, the way the UN operates, the way most of these international bodies operate, are not the way they ought to operate. They should be much more open, much more transparent. I don't know that much about the provision of scientific advice at the UN level. I know it's patchy in some areas, but I don't have a good view. I'm absolutely sure it could be a lot better at the European Union as well, that having greater input there would be good. But then I have a huge frustration as a massive Europhile. The way Europe actually operates frustrates me intensely. But then, there's a slightly bizarre idea in this country that you're either in favour of everything that happens in Brussels or against everything that happens in Brussels. And it seems to me it's quite possible to say, yes, in principle, but could we fix all the following long list of things? Do you want me to talk about the others?
Liam, do you have any ideas for improving policy making in the EU, or is it sort of...
No.
Okay. David,
and I could offer you an opinion, but without the evidence, and I think that wouldn't be in the spirit of this debate.
That's very good. David, what do you think? What do you think about this? I think it's really interesting.
I agree, it is very interesting. And Anne Glover has been a very useful step forward. It is only the start, and there are still some really egregious examples. And I'm thinking, for example, whether neonicotinoids were responsible for the big decline in the bee population, where there was some research done that suggested that although you could administer these in high dosage in controlled environments that affected bees, in the natural environment it wasn't at all clear it was having an effect on bees, but nevertheless the EU went ahead with banning a whole range of neonicotinoids, which is going to make present real challenges for European agriculture. And we have those type of examples all the time. It is very frustrating. Anne is operating pretty much on her own. She has this title of the advisor to Barroso, but her problem, if I may say so, I think she would agree with this, is that she's not plugged into the European structure. She hasn't got support staff around her. Her position is very much a kind of personal one as an advisor. What I would like to see in the future is that role being properly supported and being properly incorporated into decision-taking processes in the European Union, more like the way the Chief Science Advisor, and this has happened under successive governments, is in the UK, so we can do more.
It's really interesting. There was a very interesting session, I think, a year ago at Sprue, where Anne Glover seemed to say that actually all the advice she gave was extremely good until it got near the politicians in the council, and then things started going rather sort of more pear-shaped or whatever. Now, this very interesting question about private sector providers. As the private sector does more, we move to payment by results, but people might regard it sort of almost commercially proprietary, that I have the intervention that works. I'm not going to tell you how to do it because we contract on a sort of black box basis. David, back to you. What do you think we need to put in place to make sure that is publicly funded? So how does it stay as public knowledge?
I would say the process of contracting can force everybody to be more explicit about what you're after, and then in turn, and following on from that, then to monitor performance. Now, it can... so I think one of the great advantages of this process is it surfaces and make explicit a whole host of trade-offs that are implicit and not really exposed if it's all just happening internally. So it's almost regardless of who ends up winning the contract, the very fact that you're making those processes as explicit is valuable. You then hit the kind of coast theory of the firm issue. At what point are the costs of contracting exceeding the value of the improvements in performance that you get? Because a firm... The Coase argument is firms exist. People don't just turn up every day and write a labour contract for that day. There are firms themselves operate often on close to a command and control model. So where does the market stop and an internal organisation take over? And I think that the contracting debate is forcing government in turn to take that decision, which is a very interesting and important one.
Liam, do you have views on contracting?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it's a really significant issue. And I give you the example of the work programme when it was first introduced. It was practically impossible to get performance data out about the contractors, and it was quite obvious that there were some very bad things going wrong, and that a lot of public money was being wasted. But PQs, freedom of information requests, all that sort of thing. Were unable to yield any kind of transparency. And I think it's a really significant issue that government has got to take seriously. I think where you look, where you see signs of success elsewhere, so let me take the Washington State example again, the Institute of Public Policy Research there. The reason that it's so successful and the reason that it's taken so seriously by policymakers is that the question of money and efficiency is at the absolute heart of its work. So what it is really trying to look at is what are the most cost-effective ways of doing different things. And so, the National Audit Office is able to do this a bit, but it tends to write blockbusters rather than provide ongoing monitoring and coverage. And I think there's a real question for us in this country about whether we need a much more congressional budget office style approach to monitoring programme spend. Because at the moment, I say this as an opposition politician, but I would say it too from my time in government, there just isn't enough information about what actually delivers your biggest bang for the buck. And in a world where you're devolving more and more and you're contracting more and more out, that becomes a really, really significant matter of public concern.
Julian, do you want to pick up anything on the contracting point? Then just because I'm very conscious of time, I'm going to ask you all to answer the sort of question that incredibly neatly links back to where you started, which actually is open policy making and evidence policy making. Are they happy bedfellows, or is there a potential conflict, and how do you see those two, both desirable in themselves, sitting together effectively? So,
firstly, it's a really fascinating, important question about the private sector contracting out, and we should have more transparency of what's going on and extend FOI and all that sort of stuff. And writing the contracts correctly is important. But there's a real challenge, which I was always told as Goodhart's theorem, that anything which is a good proxy for something you really care about stops being a good proxy when you tell people you're measuring it. It applies to academics. If you say we'll judge you by the number of papers you publish, academics respond by publishing a lot more papers because that's the metric. Suddenly say it has to be in these journals, suddenly it's, people change their behaviours. So you have to write the contract to really hit on the things you care about, or else companies will very well do what they're told and paid for, which isn't necessarily what you want. I think part of the solution is sort of revealed by the problem that there was with the Atos contract, which we're now finally ending, which is if you have a single contractor, it is very hard to work out how it's doing compared to how it might do. That if that you don't have any natural experiments, you don't have the ability to say, no, you're just not getting it right. Maybe something's just really hard to do. If you have multiple contracts, then you do have that ability to say, you have the Yorkshire contract, you are doing worse than the Cornwall contract. Why? And maybe we'll let these people take it over. So you have to keep that going. In terms of open policy making and evidence-informed policy making, I mean, there are tensions. There are massive tensions between whether you want to have that sort of wisdom of the crowds, which can be incredibly accurate and can be completely and utterly wrong, with the evidence focus. But I think we're so far behind the limits of both of them that I think we can go out. If you imagine some sort of graph, or there's some sort of limiting line of what you can achieve, we're well within that space. And we can have much more open policy making and much more evidence-informed policy making for, I think, quite a long time before we start to get to the ultimate trade-offs. And there are some beautiful models of open policy making which really have contributed. Crowdsourcing information can be I certainly find, an incredibly effective way of actually getting information on something. I can tweet out and say, does anybody know about this particular thing? And actually find the one academic in the country who happens to know about it. And I don't know how else one could do that if you try to keep all the information centrally.
David, reconciling evidence-based and open policy making, you have to do this on a daily basis. It's the government's committed to both, so...
Yeah, and this is a very good note on which to end, as you say, because policy making is ultimately a very human activity, and it isn't. And there's lots of it where you are engaged in what I regard as the day-to-day business of politics, which is like so many other social activities. There are trade-offs. You're calling in favours. You're appealing to reciprocity. You're finding what the other person really cares about in some other neck of the woods, and they can have what they care about if you'll get what you care about. All those type of considerations, ways of operating that we use in the rest of life, we also use in politics and in policy making. And it's very hard to see how, as humans, we would do it any other way. I don't feel ashamed about it, but certainly there are times when the set of trade-offs you're making and why are very hard to explain. I mean, I think of ministers coming back from Brussels, where you've won some things, you never win everything, you've conceded on some other things. And you can't quite ever say, well, the French really cared about that. And if we gave away on that, then we won over the East Europeans, who in turn therefore give their votes to support us on something else. It's not necessarily, you can't always give the gory details. The famous remark of Bismarck that those who love laws, like those who love sausages, should not see how they're made. So there is, you can't, but all I can tell you is it's just like the rest of life. It's just like dealing with your friends, it's just like being a member of a family, and all those type of exchanges would be hard openly to capture and convey. So I think my final appeal is treat all this as ultimately a human process. That's why, although, as I say, ironically, I've just come from a meeting on e-infrastructure, and you can do modelling and big data counts and everything, I think the activity of politics will still remain very significant, however powerful our computers and perfect our data.
So David, does that fundamentally mean, I just want to test you on this, I mean, the government has said, and it's implying that there is a degree of change here, that it is moving towards more open policy making, assuming that the sort of status quo is not as open as it could desirably need to be. I mean, are you saying actually that's, it's a bit of a naive belief that politics can be done differently?
No, I mean, as you said in your introduction, I mean, I was a minister 15 years ago, and coming back, I would say, sorry, Liam, you want to give
Liam's
Liam his
got
chance?
to go,
Right.
so I'm going to give Liam a very
Liam.
quick last word. Sorry.
I mean, just only to underline something David said, really, which is that I'm afraid ultimately political policy making is an art and not a science.
That's a neat way. That's a very good way.
Okay, we're going to... I was under brief. I was trying to give you the full length of the session rather than know that Liam had a hard deadline there, so no worries about that. I think that may be a debate that we have to leave on for the drink session or whatever. I think it's really interesting. I think it's really interesting about whether you can open up actually the evidence bases on which government's making decisions. At least government say, this is our assessment of the evidence base.
Yeah,
so.
just to finish on that. So I would say that, and I think partly the civil service culture has changed. I think that compared with what happened 15 years ago, I would say that now there is more openness. I would say parliamentary answers. I'll give you an example from when you and I began in the Treasury in 1978.
You're not going to say that. Not live streamed.
Should I say what I did?
I remember the first a parliamentary question that came to me to answer as a civil servant, which was about our estimates of our North Sea oil reserves. And we just had some new estimates of North Sea oil reserves, and they were quite tricky. I can't remember if they'd gone up or down, because we thought it was going to affect the pound. And I went to my boss and said, look, how are we going to answer this question? And he said, it's very simple. The latest published estimates for oil reserves are, and he simply gave what had most recently been published. Now, I don't think nowadays we would get away with that quite so easily. We would have the argument, hang on, we have got this information, we're obliged to share it with people. You can't simply rely on the last published evidence. If there are later data, you're obliged to share it with the House of Commons. So I personally think standards on all that type of transparency have got better. The paradox is I don't think there's been any gain in trust as a result.
Julian has asked if you can take the slot that I was reserving for Liam to have a last comment on that. So, Julian.
So I actually, instead of what I was going to say, I'm just fascinated by David's comment now. Could you answer the questions I tabled to the Home Office, please? Because I just today got questions back on things like, what assessment has you made of the cost of buying a water cannon? To which the answer was, the Home Secretary has received a request to allow them, is trying to decide whether to allow them or not, which is not an answer to the question, what is the cost, which is a factual based thing. But I do think it would be really good to get much more transparency of that, because whether it's water cannon or something else, it is entirely possible to say, here is all the evidence and I've made a decision, and here is all the evidence somebody else would make a different decision. That's perfectly fine, but I don't think we're yet there in presenting that information. And the one thing I would say to you, as at least some of the publics who are here, is that it is important to judge political decision-making, partly based on whether it is a reasonable decision to make, not just whether you agree with it. Because currently one of the problems is that the electorate support decisions they agree with, not necessarily things which are actually rationally driven. And so there is a strong selective pressure on politicians to say the thing that's popular rather than the thing that necessarily is actually either right or evidence-based or whatever it might be. There needs to be some sort of corrective pressure, whether it's through sort of ask for evidence campaigns or something, to suggest that people should actually do evidence-informed decision-making as well.
Okay, I think that's a great point to end. So thank you, David, Julian, and the now absent Liam. But if he's watching the last minute live streamed, he can see that he's being thanked too. So could you all thank the panel?
Thank you, Jill, yes.
And now I think we're going to vacate the stage for your leader to come on with some final comments.
Thanks. Firstly, thank Jill as well as the rest of the panel for that excellently interesting discussion. And now my job is really only to briefly wrap up today, to thank the many people that have helped make today work so well. And principally, of course, that's thank you to you for coming. As you know, the Centre for Science and Policy exists to try and strengthen the engagement between research, evidence and expertise and people working in public policy. And yes, by science in this case, we mean research from all disciplines, from English, history, philosophy, biology, computer science. I mean, I could go on and on, all the disciplines. So, I mean, we did at one point consider changing our name to Centre for Research and Policy. Then it was quickly decided that wouldn't be a good idea. But that is what we do. And so the principal thing we do is bring together policy fellows. And I'm really pleased that so many of our policy fellows, who are people working in public policy, either in government or people working in industry or the third sector, that have interest and contribute to public policy debates, become engaged with what we do and make stronger links with a research base through our programme. And I'm very pleased that so many of those fellows are here. And just in a side comment to the panel discussion, I'd like to mention that many of our very good policy fellows are also working on in the European Commission, and also here today also people contributing in the UN system as well. So it isn't just about the evidence-informed policymaking in the UK. So I think that it helps us in sort of curating and supporting these kinds of engagements to take time periodically to reflect on the conditions in government and in the wider public for these kinds of relations to take place. So I think that's what today has provided. We started with a very powerful discussion about open policy making from Richard Heaton that set some of the scenes for what's going on now and what the opportunities are for the kinds of engagement we want to encourage. We looked at the particular case of big data and the challenges of enacting the huge potential there to make government better and the services for citizens better, and what might need to be put in place to take advantage of those things. But also I want to then, after lunch, we moved to 3 parallel sessions, which were very much convened by 3 of our policy fellows. And that's really as part of this process that David Cleaveley mentioned in the morning of policy challenges. So if the policy fellowship is really our primary, the bedrock of our activity, we're increasingly asking our policy fellows if they want to work with each other and groups of academics to spend a little bit more time exploring specific issues. And so the 3 parallel sessions today were an opportunity for further discussion. And I just ask the 3 policy fellows that helped convene those sessions if they'd come up now and just give us a very brief summary of some of the main points that came from their discussion, to give a sense for those who weren't in their group what was going on. And if I ask you just really, really briefly, I think in the order in which they were in the programme, I think that's Liz, Chris and Andrea. If you just give a sort of... Do you have mics? Yeah. So Liz, the headlines.
Right. I was looking at behavioural. Thank you. My prop. I was looking at behavioural science, and either we were in a very small room or there was a lot of interest, and it was in the library, which isn't that small. So for everybody who came into the behavioural science session, thank you for that. I was lucky enough to share the platform with Ed Gallier and Teresa Marteau, who have really opened my eyes to behavioural science. So it was a privilege for me to do that. Ed spoke about the importance of emergency planning, response, and how people behave in emergency. Teresa made a plea for action in terms of more behavioural science in the way we go about bringing policy about. I spoke about this little document here, which is, I believe, the first policy challenge brief. So we were looking at how we could introduce behavioural science into emergency response. And Rob was kind enough to say, well, how about we do an experiment and look about how we can create some thoughts together. So that's how that came about. So there was a really active Q&A session at the end. And for all of those of you who spoke, forgive me, but 2 things I just thought were quite interesting that came out of that. Clearly, when we're looking at how to modify policy for behaviour in emergencies, it's really helpful if we can get contemporary evidence of behaviour in emergencies. But the way we're structured in the UK means that by the time the academic has applied for funding, the emergency was some years ago, literally. So how can we adapt to make sure that academics working in this area can actually plan to collect that contemporary evidence? And the second question that I was extremely grateful I wasn't asked at the time, and I'm not answering it now either, I put it back to you, is there is a legal framework for acting in emergencies, and there is an ethical manner in which we will all behave. And I think, for example, the military will a very fine example of this, the way that they have a legal backdrop. When a soldier is at war, that can change. Should the ethics of public behaviour change? And I leave that thought with you.
Thank you. Chris?
Well, our session was about open innovation, and the question was, how open is open innovation in the UK? And I think in a nutshell, the answer was, or the challenge that was really put to the audience was that it is not open enough. We had a number of interesting presentations and discussion points and so on. A number of things came up. One is that despite the apparent death of distance due to the internet and other factors, that location is still relevant to innovation and to open innovation in particular. That companies are indeed in some ways probably innovating in a very open manner without necessarily thinking about it in that way. When you look at what companies are doing, there is an appetite to do more. Some of them may see it as business as usual. Others of them may proactively think about what are the networks that they're engaging in and how can they make best use of them and how can they strengthen them. I think there was also a challenge to universities. When you look at the relationship between companies and universities, there are difficulties in the relationship. IP is a factor. I think it has been for a long time, and I think the main message is that it is still a factor and it needs to be resolved. It may be an issue to do with language, understanding and communication, different communities talking different languages. But it also, I think, a recognition that perhaps universities themselves could be more open to innovation and open to different models of working with companies. As someone put it, businesses are becoming more like schools and universities are becoming more like businesses.
Thank you.
So we have that challenge. I'm going to carry on very briefly because a lot of this is about building trusted relationships, about co-creation and co-sharing. And I think there was the final thought that if you have an open science base, that provides a very good platform then for an open innovation system. Thanks.
Thank you. Andrea?
Yes. So finally, we were looking at the topic of an ageing society, and I was joined by Professor John Clarkson from the Cambridge Engineering Design Centre and Rama Guerrero from the Royal College of Arts, and I really felt they brought the discussion to life because they had a lot of examples, practical examples of design solutions. So we started off by considering probably what is now familiar context for the ageing population. So the doubling of 85-year-olds by 2030 as we see the post-war baby boomers ageing and moving into older age, and obviously as life expectancy increases. We were reminded that this is actually a global phenomenon, not just for the UK. And we also thought, well, yeah, we should be celebrating this fact. But there's no doubt that old age brings with it lots of complex issues and challenges. But there is a desire for by the older generation to be independent. And in fact, there is a need for the older generation to be independent because there will just be fewer carers around. But the flip side of being independent is that the older generation risks being excluded or socially isolated and not participating fully in society. And that brings with it another range of problems, health issues and not being valued for what they do. So the solutions that we discussed were all focusing on design, but not sort of necessarily just design for older people. This was a really important point. It's not just about the grab rails. It's about ideas that are accessible products for everybody. And if you get that right, then you generate a better business case, which reduces the commercial risk and encourages companies to develop more of these products. Because we felt there was a real barrier around a risk on this. We discussed the importance of co-creation and design, and I think we were all touched by an example that Rama brought, which was an elderly lady who was able to turn on her TV herself for the first time in 10 years as a result of someone redesigning the 3 very complicated remote controls that she had to deal with into a single sort of box that she could easily operate. We also looked at work and enabling people to work for longer and trying to think about designing the right sort of environment for that to take place, thinking about job roles and offering more flexible working. A lot of the discussion was around the current old, but it's going to be really valuable to think about those baby boomers as they move into old age as a different generation. They've grown up with a different set of values and experiences, particularly of technology. So we need to understand, get behind the numbers and understand what they will really be like so we can plan policies accordingly. So we had a really good discussion, lots of connections, lots of things to follow up for the policy challenge.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for that summary. I didn't do a proper introductions, but it's in the programme. Andrea Lee from Department of Health, Chris Pook from BIS, and Liz Serkovich from the Government Office for Science. I think, well, one thing that you can kind of hear from that is partly an answer to Miles Barker's question about, you can see there the interconnection, the positive interconnection between, ideas from open policy making and evidence-informed policy making. So I think that's a very helpful summary. All I need to do now, in the remaining very few seconds, is to thank our principal sponsors, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and our other sponsors, the Babraham Institute and Lloyds. Also thank CSaP, the Cambridge University Science Policy Exchange, which is the early career and student group that seeks to work with us and others to also try and broker these links. And CSaP in particular, you will have noticed, they've helped us a lot on the day, but in particular have run the poster competition, and I have results. So the winner, I can announce the winner, and you'll be amused that the prize that this lucky winner will receive is a day with one of our policy fellows in a government department. Now, for some of you, that might seem a bit funny. Yeah, you might. But we tried this last year, and the recipient of the prize was delighted. So you see, there you go. So we're going to try it again. I won't. So the prize goes to Kit Huckvale from Imperial College, the Global eHealth Unit, whose poster was to the title, Using Smartphone Apps to Manage Long-Term Conditions. So congratulations, Kit. Finally, I'd like to thank once again you for coming. I'd like to ask you to thank once again all the speakers and chairs, and then make sure you complete your evaluation form. How could you, having listened through the day, depart without completing your evaluation form? And perhaps even commenting, not only completing it, but commenting on the form, and perhaps, but please complete the evaluation form. Please join us for a drink afterwards, but before doing either of those, please join me in thanking all the speakers and chairs that made today's session successful.